Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf ayin. Shavua tov to everyone. Okay, I will prepare you. Brace yourselves if the last few dafim weren't complicated enough. Today's daf is definitely of the more complicated dafim of Shas. So prepare yourselves, and I did prepare a sheet to help organize. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to review what we did yesterday to just give it all kind of perspective and put everything together. So the main thing we're going to deal with today are 3 psukim, and it's important to understand them well and know what we're talking about before we start so that you have that background. Okay, it's always important in a complicated Gemara shir to know what the facts are that you need to know before you start. So there's a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Zayin, pasuk tefav, which says, Kol nefesh asher tochal, a person who eats nevela or a treifa. Okay, but as Rachel Bager, I'm only going to talk about the important words here. Kibes wadav, rachatz b'mayim, the person is impure. Okay? Now, it's an impurity of eating. So, now the rabbis have this concept of something called a nevelat of tahor, which we talked about, is when you eat it, you're actually tamei. So they assume that this pasuk, even though it never says bird in this pasuk, okay, there's an assumption that the pasuk is talking about nevelat of tahor. Okay? Now, how do we know it's only tahor? That we already talked about. We're going to talk about more today, right? Because that's just, in other words, you have to remember, we're coming from the rabbinic Talmud, which has certain basics, like, oh, it's an nevelat of tahor. But we're going to have to figure out today is where do they get that it's only, right? Remember, tahor, it's one thing that's very confusing about this sugya is to know when tamei means impurity and when tamei means not kosher. Okay? So in a nevelat of tahor, actually it's ironic because it's tahor there means kosher, not pure. A nevela of a kosher bird is metame, okay, has impurity to it. Okay, it's a little also ironic, like the nevela of a bird that's not kosher doesn't have this impurity. Okay, well, we're going to talk about that also. But anyway, that's one thing to know. So this pasuk is talking about that. Now I'm going to skip the next pasuk for a minute. I'm going to jump to another pasuk. There's another pasuk in Vayikra Kaf Bet, which is also talking about a nevelat of tahor. And both psukim mention also nevela, also treifa. What's confusing in the pasuk is why is it mentioning treifa in these psukim, right? That's where we got in the whole thing. So nevela utreifa lo yochal litam'a ba'ani Hashem. So it says you can't eat nevela and treifa, which we know you can't eat nevela and treifa, right? They're forbidden. Again, a nevela is an animal that died, or in this case, it's actually a bird, which we don't yet know, but it says, and a treifa is an animal that's not, right, has some blemish in it, it won't survive very long. You can't eat it, okay, which would have been fine if the pasuk just stopped there, but it says litam abba. You can't eat it to make impurity. So the rabbis also assume that this pasuk is also talking about nevelat of tahor because it's talking about the nevela of an animal that when you eat, it becomes tamei. Okay, so there's tumah put together with eating. So, and the only time you have tumah put together with eating, that while you're eating it, it's tamei, right? That's a nevelat of. Then we go to this pasuk Vayikra Zayin, and this was all because of Rav Shizbi. He brings up this pasuk cheilev nevela v'cheilev treifa. Now, the only reason why we're bringing this pasuk has a bunch of major differences. First of all, it's a case where we have something from a nevela and a treifa that's actually not impure. Okay, that's the first thing. The cheilev of a nevela and the cheilev of a treifa is actually pure, doesn't carry impurity. But why we're bringing up this pasuk? Because it also puts together nevela and treifa. And every time we have that, we want to figure out, like Rav Shizbi brought this pasuk, and we'll go over that in another 2 minutes, to say, oh, well, however we define treifa there is how we're going to find treifa in our original pasuk in Vayikra Yud Zayin Tefav about the nevelat of tahor. Okay, and that's how we got there. But now let's go all the way back to the Mishnah because I really want to make sure you have this all in your head before we move on. So we have a 3-way machloket, although Rabbi Yossi we really ended up barely dealing with. But we have a 3-way machloket between Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi about what if I'm in the mikdash and I do melika to a bird, and it turns out, after I kill the bird, I realize the bird was a treifa, right? Sometimes you don't realize there was something wrong inside the bird until you open it up. So when I opened it up, I realized it was a treifa. Is that bird going to have tumat beit habli or not? Okay, now normally, shchita removes, right? What does it mean? Nevela is it died without slaughtering. So do shchita, right? If shchita removes it, comes Rabbi Meir and says, just like shchita removes it. In other words, again, let's go back to an animal, Rabbi Meir says. He brings this kavachomer. If a nevela of a behema, which is actually, right, it's mitabe b'magol masa, and its shchita prevents it from being, now this is a fact everyone agrees to. You slaughter a treifa animal, it's not a nevela, okay? But the question is that same thing true for a bird? So basically what you have to do is 2 steps. Rabbi Meir says, well, we're going to learn from shchita of an animal, where definitely everyone agrees it's not going to be a nevela. It's not going to have that impurity of a nevela. So the shchita prevents that impurity. Likewise, the shchita of a bird is going to prevent the impurity of a bird. And likewise, it's going to also, if you did melika, because shchita and melika are the same thing, because shchita outside the temple means you can eat the animal. Melika inside the temple means you can eat the animal. Okay? So from there he makes that jump. The Gemara actually rejects, okay, we saw this already, rejects that drasha because of Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi says if you're going to learn something from a kav chomer, you can only learn it as far as the kav chomer goes. Now the kav chomer went from nevela of an animal that was slaughtered to the slaughtering of a bird, but you can't take it all the way to melika, to which the Gemara said, oh yeah, Rabbi Meir, what are you going to say to that? So in the end, the Gemara actually gave a different reason. It said the reason in the Mishnah isn't really the reason of Rabbi Meir, but, right, how did they do that, by the way? Because we don't know if Rabbi Meir actually said it himself. Maybe someone who was putting together the Mishnah gave a reason for him. So they said that can't be the reason. It must be this drasha on Zot Torah Be'ema Va'of, and it's making this comparison between animals and birds, and from there they learn this comparison. Okay, again, I'm not going to review everything. So now, Rabbi Yehuda came along and said, no, and this is where we got all started on this complicated mahalach, which is, why does it say treifa in that first pasuk? What does treifa mean? He says, and then he has this whole thing, if the treifa is alive, if the treifa is dead, right? Either which way, you could learn treifa from nevela. So he says it must be coming to say, a treifa that is slaughtered is actually, now what's the pasuk? If you slaughter a bird, and it's a treifa, it's going to be impure. And therefore, he goes completely against Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Meir as the other extreme position. If you have a treifa of an animal, of course, if it's slaughtered, it removes the tumah of nevela. But in a bird, it doesn't do anything. How do we know? Because the pasuk says a treifa. It adds a treifa to the pasuk to say, even if you slaughter a treifa, because it doesn't need to come for a regular treifa, right? A treifa that just dies, let's say, of course, that's a nevela. So treifa in that pasuk must be coming to say, if you slaughter it, it's still going to be impure. Comes Rav Shizbi, okay, second chart on the page. So Rav Shizbi comes along and basically says, and that's where the cheilev nevela pasuk comes in. He says, let's go to the cheilev nevela pasuk. There we cannot define treifa the way you did. It's not going to be a treifa that's slaughtered. Now, why? Because treifa that's slaughtered, okay, in an animal, because cheilev is obviously talking about an animal, it's the fats of the animal. Treifa that's slaughtered is going to be, right, everyone agrees that the animal's good. Now, what's this pasuk telling you? The cheilev is good. The cheilev isn't impure. But the animal obviously is, right, the rest of the meat. And nobody thinks that that's true in an animal. So you can't explain treifa as a treifa that was slaughtered. So what does he say treifa is? Treifa means an animal that could potentially become a treifa, meaning this pasuk is only true for kosher animals. That's what he says the word treifa comes. And then he applies that to the Nevelat Of pasuk, and he says if that's what treifa means there, then that's what treifa is going to mean in the Nevelat Of pasuk. Treifa doesn't mean a treifa that gets slaughtered, like you said, Rabbi Yehuda. No, a treifa means this is only kosher birds. Okay, we're almost at the end of yesterday's daf. This is the summary of it. Treifa means this is only true for kosher birds, and that we know is true, right? Because what do we call it? The tumah of Nevelat Of tahor, only kosher birds. So that makes sense halachically. The question is that the drasha? So he thinks, once you explain, right, the cheilev treifa, he says, is the only way you can explain the cheilev pasuk is saying kosher. So we're going to apply that same definition to the treifa and the other pasuk, which is kind of logical. But the Gemara ended with this braita at the end of the daf, which said, I'm just going to read it quickly. Titania. So we're basically, what we're going to say now is, okay, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need this pasuk by Nevelat Of, this Vayikra Yud Zayin Tevav, to teach us just kosher bird. Why? Because he learns just kosher bird from a different pasuk. Which pasuk? In comes that third pasuk. Okay, and that's why I brought 3 pasukim. Because Vayikra Kafbet, which is the second pasuk about Nevelat Of, says Nevela Utreifa, Lo Yochal Tamaba, and not from the word treifa, but he's going to learn it from somewhere else. He's going to say, Yacholte Nevelat Of Tamei Metama Begadim Abed Abliya. You might have thought a non-kosher bird also has this tumah if it just dies. But Talmud Lomar Nevela Utreifa Lo Yochal. Don't eat it, right? It's a weird pasuk. Don't eat it, Letamaba. Don't eat it, right? And if you eat it, you're going to carry impurity. So what do we learn from here? Mishi Isuro Mishum Bal Tochal Nevela. What are we going to say here? This is only for a kosher bird. Why? Because the pasuk says don't eat it. Why don't eat it? Because it's an egla. Not don't eat it because it's not kosher. Right? Remember, not kosher fits in, right? Comes in, let's say a pig, okay? A pig dies, don't eat it. What do you mean don't eat it because a pig died, right? Or a non-kosher bird died, right? Maybe a pig is a bad example, but you take a non-kosher bird that dies. Don't eat it because it's an avela. What do you mean don't eat it because it's an avela? You couldn't eat it even before it became an avela. If you slaughtered it, you couldn't eat it. So this pasuk is already excluding birds who you can't eat for other reasons. Okay? So he says, I don't need your pasuk, right? The treifa there to come teach me this is only kosher birds, because I have a different pasuk to prove it. And furthermore, now what about the cheilev pasuk? What's he going to, right? Cheilev nebela, cheilev treifa. Now the assumption is if he doesn't think treifa means that word is coming to say kosher only, so where is he going to learn the cheilev nebela, cheilev treifa pasuk? Kosher birds, kosher animals only, the cheilev is tahor. He's going to do the same thing, because look at that pasuk. It also asks, acholo tochluhu, right? Don't eat it. Now, we're going to say, hainami, top of our daf now. Hainami tepukle. The other one we're also going to learn from the pasuk, cheilev nevela. Mishi isuro mishu, in the same manner, basically. That's what we're going to do the same. We're going to say in the same manner you can learn the cheilev pasuk, the cheilev nevela, cheilev treifa is also only talking about kosher, right? Again, what does that mean? Kosher animals, if they die, the cheilev is actually not going to carry impurity. But obviously, if it's non-kosher, not only will the animal have impurity, the cheilev will also have impurity. So now why is that? Mishi suro mishum bal tochal cheilev nevela. Yastazo she'eni sura mishum bal tochal cheilev nevela ela mishum tamei. Okay, now we're going to say, look, again, tamei here means not kosher. Okay? Now, if you have a non-kosher animal, it's not going to be a cholo tochlu, don't eat it because it died and it's an avela now, okay? Or don't eat its cheilev because it comes from an animal that died. No, you can't eat its cheilev because it's not a kosher animal. And you can't eat non-kosher animals ever. So exactly the same thing we did with Vayikra Kaf Bet, Nevela Treifa Lo Yochal Tamaba, we now did with Cheilev Nevela Cheilev Treifa for Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says this pasuk is coming to teach you only a kosher animal, and that other pasuk is coming to teach you only a kosher bird. Okay, so that, what he did in these two sections, this last thing about Rabbi Yehuda, is all just undermining Rav Shizbi's difficulty, because Rav Shizbi needed the word treifa to teach you that, in which case Rabbi Yehuda didn't have the word treifa to teach him a treifa shenishchetam, v'yikra yud zayin tefa, v'chol nefesh asher tochal nebelau treifa. So, once he says, oh, I don't need that pasuk because I can learn it not from the word treifa, but from actually the fact that it says don't eat it. And that appears in Kaf Bet, and it appears in Zayin, and that's where we get those two halakhot. Okay, so now we're good, but we're really not good yet because we still have a lot more things to do here. So now they're going to say, Elahai. So that's part one of the sugya. Okay, I thought it was very important to understand it in sections. This is part one that we're going to come back to. Part one is the difficulty of Rav Shizbi on Rabbi Yehuda and how he understood the pasuk in Vayikra Yud Zayin Tevav, which is called, right, our first original pasuk about Nevelat Of, the word treifa there, which Rabbi Yehuda took as the basis of his whole shita, that any treifa bird that's slaughtered, right, is not going to be removed from this impurity. Slaughtering a bird that's a treifa doesn't remove impurity. Even though it does in an animal, it does not in a bird, and that's his drasha. Rav Shizbi tried to undermine it by saying treifa means something else, and if treifa means something else in the cheilev pasuk, it must mean that in the other pasuk. And you need to, in both these pasukim, eliminate non-kosher from the picture. Rabbi Yehuda actually agrees that you need to eliminate non-kosher from the picture, but he darshans it from a different manner, okay? Not from the word treifa, but from the don't eat. And brings in a third pasuk, right? A second pasuk of Nevelat Of to learn from Nevelat Of. And from the cheilev pasuk itself, he learns also that it's only kosher animals. What we're going to have to come back to is a little bit more about Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. What does he do with these pasukim? But what we're now going to do is, and it's really not in the chart, although I guess I could have put it in the chart, but what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the word treifa in that pasuk of cheilev? That's what we're going to do now. We're going to kind of leave our sugya for a minute, because what only interests us right now, and for this we're going to have three opinions within Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, we're going to have option one, which is going to be rejected by two difficulties. Option two, of which is an unnamed answer, like it doesn't say who said the answer. Then we're going to have Abaye, who brings another answer about what the treifa is coming for in that pasuk. 2 difficulties on that, and then Rav is going to bring an answer that's going to last. Okay, and that's going to be most of the end of the sugya. Then we'll come back to Rabbi Meir and what does he do with those psukim. Okay, and then we're going to get off from the sugya, connected, but a little, like the complicated part will be up until then, basically. So now we want to figure out what does the word treifa and cheilev nevela and cheilev treifa coming for Rabbi Yehuda. Now remember, in the pasuk of nevela of, we know what treifa is coming to do, a treifa that's slaughtered, right? That's what he says. But we're not going to be able to plug that into cheilev nevela, because if it's slaughtered, what did we say? An animal that's slaughtered, right, is no longer a nevela anymore. So there will be nothing to say here. So let's see. So now we're going to, although maybe, we'll get there. So now we're going to say, alahai treifa mibaile la'atuye chaya. Let's go talk about the difference between an animal and a behema and a chaya. A behema is a domesticated animal. A chaya is a non-domesticated animal. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important for laws of cheilev. Okay, the first thing to know about, or not the first thing, but the first thing for our purposes to know about an animal and a domesticated and non-domesticated animal is that a domesticated animal is brought for a sacrifice, and a non-domesticated animal is never brought as a sacrifice. Okay, like an ayil, not an ayil, tzvi, like a deer. We don't bring deers as sacrifices. Those are chayot. Okay, just as an example. But behemot are brought, right? All the animals we bring. Shor, kesef, ez, all those. Those are all animals. Okay, para, all that. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, what is isur cheilev? Okay, what do we know about cheilev? Cheilev is what we burn on the altar. Remember, we burn cheilev on the altar in the sacrifices. Notice we do them to behemot, not to chayot, because there are no chayot on the altar. So the isur of eating cheilev is interconnected with that. Because these are parts, now it doesn't say this directly, but it seems pretty clear that there's a correlation here. These are parts that get offered on the altar when you bring a sacrifice. Well, when you slaughter an animal not for sacrificial purposes, the cheilevs are forbidden to eat. You just can't eat them. We've talked a lot about cheilev when we talked about isur karet, right? It's a class of isur karet. Okay, anyway. So there's no isur eating cheilev for undomesticated animals, for chayot. Now we have this pasuk, which isn't, now it's sort of talking about not eating the cheilev, because it says cheilev nevela, cheilev treifa. Okay, let's go back to the pasuk for a minute. Took off the study guide for a minute. Let's put it back. It says cheilev nevela v'cheilev treifa yaseh l'chom halacha. It will be pure. V'achol lo tochluhu, but don't eat it. Now, don't eat it. Why? Because it's cheilev. Cheilev in general is forbidden. Don't eat it. So does that only mean domesticated animals where cheilev is forbidden, and only then will the cheilev be tahor if it, right? So again, we have 3 scenarios, okay? We have a cheilev, or 2 scenarios. We have a cheilev of an animal that was slaughtered, that you can't eat the meat, but it's not impure because it was slaughtered, right? The whole animal is not impure. But if you have a nevela where the animal just died, the meat is obviously impure because nevela is impure. That's the whole thing, tumat nevela. But the cheilev is not. That's the chiddush here. So is that but you can't eat it, but it just doesn't have impurity. Okay? So does this apply for chaya? So the first interpretation is that's what treifa is coming to tell you. This applies also to chayot. So, now, you might have thought that it doesn't. Why? For the reasons I just said. You might have thought that pasuk applies to someone whose cheilev is forbidden and meat is permitted, as we described, right? You can't eat the cheilev. It says it. Achol lo tochlu. Yatzazo shechabal b'sara mutar. And you might have thought, so excluded from this category of what this pasuk is talking about is a chaya, because you can, right? In a regular case, you can eat the cheilev and you can eat the meat. There's no isur cheilev and chaya. So maybe because it says don't eat the cheilev, this must be talking about behemot and achayot. Kamash malan. That's what the word treifa. Now it's a little hard to say the treifa includes a chaya, but it's coming to include some other case. And already, if we go with what Rabbi Yehuda said before, well, there's really no point because you can learn that from the Bela. So it must be coming to teach the chaya. But the Gemara rejects this. Okay, it says Amar Leib, mine is in parentheses. It doesn't belong here because there is no person that someone said back to. Okay, that would be if we knew there were 2 people talking here. Right, then he said to him, but there is no he. It's just this the stama de Gemara, as we say, like without unnamed. Anyway, the Gemara asks, Maishna tmea. Okay, so there's going to be two difficulties here. Ma'ishna tmea. Now, tmea means non-kosher. Now, how is non-kosher different from an animal? Right? Well, we're going to say this pasuk doesn't apply. Remember, everyone agrees the pasuk doesn't apply to non-kosher animals. Well, the ein chalut mibsara. What typifies the difference between a non-kosher animal and the kosher animals relates to cheilev? Well, the cheilev in a kosher animal is different from the meat. The meat can be eaten, the cheilev can't. In a non-kosher animal, nothing can be eaten, right? So there's no difference between the cheilev and the meat. Chaya nami, now a chaya in the same way is really like a non-kosher animal. Even though it's opposite, but ein chalut mibsara. It's the same that the cheilev is no different from the meat. Now, in a non-kosher animal, you can't eat either. In a kosher chaya, undomesticated animal, you can eat the cheilev, you can eat the meat. So basically, to say that chaya is included with a kosher animal doesn't make so much sense. Because in terms of, if this is a unique cheilev issue, that the cheilev is pure, you got to find something where in general there's a difference between the cheilev and the meat. And that doesn't apply for chaya. Ve'od, and furthermore, haktiv achol lo tochlu. The pasuk says, don't eat the cheilev. Now, if it was cheilev of an undomesticated animal, you could eat it. Cheilev chaya muteret b'achila. Okay? Right? That's my words I added here. That the cheilev of an undomesticated animal is actually permitted. So you can't say don't eat it. So, I can't be saying that this is true for a chaya. Okay, second option to explain. Now, remember this, because this is going to be very important for Rabbi. We're trying to have a Moraim figure out what the word treifa in the pasuk, cheilev, nevela, and cheilev treifa is coming according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because according to Rav Shizbi, it's coming to say this is only kosher animals. So we tried to say maybe chaya. Okay, that didn't work. Now we're going to try another attempt. Abai is going to say, treifa legufe itzrich. Okay, now, you really need it. Now, we rejected this before, but we said, no, you really need it for the case of a treifa. To say the cheilev of a treifa is pure. Now, why? Why do you need it? We tried to prove yesterday you didn't need it. Shelo tomar ho'il utmea asur mechayim utreifa asura mechayim. Now, again, tmea here means non-kosher. A non-kosher, now again, this is back to what do we compare? What's more comparable to what? A non-kosher animal is forbidden when it's alive, right? You can't eat it when it's alive, okay? You have a pig can't eat ever. Not only when it's dead, also when it's alive. Treifa is actually similar to a non-kosher animal. Why? Because it's also asura mechayim. Once the animal has this sickness, whatever it is, it's immediately forbidden right now, even if you were to slaughter it. You can't eat it. So, if we already excluded non-kosher animals from this pasuk and said, matme'ach chel batamei, right? This whole pasuk, remember what it's coming to tell us. The cheilev of an animal is, right, of an animal that died on its own, an egla, and maybe a treifa, okay? And that's what we're going to say right now, is tahor. Now, what do we need this to say? Even if it's a treifa, it's also tahor. Why? Matme, because maybe you would have thought, right, what we say before, there's no reason to think a treifa would be just like an egla. No, you might have thought that maybe a treifa is actually like a non-kosher animal. Why? Because a non-kosher animal is forbidden already when it's alive, right? An egla, when does an egla become forbidden? When the animal dies only, right? An egla can be an egla of a kosher animal, right? It could be also non-kosher, but it could be kosher. Just laws, regular laws of tumat egla, not this cheilev. So, since a non-kosher animal is already forbidden in its lifetime, treifa is actually worse than an egla and is forbidden in its lifetime. So maybe you would think, matme'ach chel batamei. So if a non-kosher animal dies or is slaughtered, doesn't matter, it's going to have tumat egla, and the cheilev is going to be impure. So af treifa chel batamei, maybe you would have thought a treifa, the cheilev, is also impure. And this pasuk maybe isn't relating to a treifa, and that's why you need the pasuk to tell you treifa. So treifa, forget everyone was trying to darshan. What do you need treifa for? No, treifa is needed to teach itself, right? That case. So now the Gemara is going to reject the bias. I said for two reasons. Ihachi hainami mibai. Wait a minute. Okay, now let's go back to I'll give you for an example. When Rav Shizbi explained what treifa means in the cheilev pasuk, we then plugged it in. He plugged it into the nevelat of pasuk, right? Whatever treifa means in Vayikra Zayin Kaf Dalet is what treifa means in Vayikra Yud Zayin Tet Vav, right? That's an assumption that Rav Shizbi made. Rav Shizbi made. We're going to make that same assumption here against Abai. Now, remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to say, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the word treifa in the cheilev pasuk? Well, once you say the word treifa there is needed for the treifa, so you don't think it's like a non-kosher bird, non-kosher animal, plug that into the nevei ladof pasuk. Remember, nevei ladof also doesn't apply to non-kosher birds. So maybe treifa is needed for itself so that you don't think it's like a non-kosher bird and there's no tumah. And if you need treifa for itself, now you're back to a problem. Because Rabbi Yehuda needed treifa to teach you the whole halach of our Mishnah. That a treifa bird that's slaughtered, it's a nevela. It's impure. It carries tumah nevela, right? Whereas that was with our whole thing. Rabbi Meir went and said not only does slaughtering remove the problem of nevela from a treifa, even melika does. But Rabbi Yehuda thought, no, it's tumah, and that's why it's in this pasuk. So if you explain Abaye that way, and remember, if you take Abaye's explanation, then and you explain Rabbi Yehuda that way, then you're stuck. Because then, again, let's read it inside. Ihachi, if so, hainami mibai. Shalo tomar, you're going to need it for the nevei ladof pasuk, for the treifa for itself. And then you won't be able to darshan it like Rabbi Yehuda did. Ho'il va'of tamei asur b'achila, utreifa asur b'achila. So again, a non-kosher bird you can't eat, and a treifa you can't eat. And you can't eat when they're alive, right? So ma of tamei no matamei, av treifa no matama. So then you would have thought, maybe a treifa doesn't have tumah. And therefore, again, I wrote here in my own words, im can. If so, how does Rabbi Yehuda learn from treifa that a treifa shenishchita has tumah nevela? So that is a problem. Again, now maybe Abai is right. That's what the pasuk is, but Abai is trying to explain it according to Rabbi Yehuda. So that can't possibly be. And furthermore, I said there's two difficulties on Abai. Ve'od mi'i kalamel of treifa mitmea. How can you learn a treifa from a non-kosher animal? Okay, because remember, we're back to the cheilev. Tmeya lo hayta lashata kosher. Treifa hayta lashata kosher. There's a big difference between a non-kosher animal, right, a pig, let's say, and a treifa that, a cow that got sick, okay, and is now a treifa. A cow that got sick was able to be eaten at some point and just can't be now. But a non-kosher animal, from the moment they were born, it was a problem. And bechitim, if you want to say, well, treifa mi beta, sometimes you have an animal that's a treifa from birth, but b'mina mi'ika, but its own type you could eat, right? Hadashat kosher. Like cow that was born sick, fine. Maybe once in a while you have a cow that's already born a treifa. But most cows are not. So basically to learn cows that are treifot from a non-kosher animal doesn't make any sense. So they basically reject Abai. The treifa is not needed for itself. Ela Amar Rava. So now comes Rava with his explanation. We're almost at the end of the really complicated part, okay? I'm sorry, Ela Amar Rava. Torah Amra, Yavo Isur Nevela v'yachul al Isur cheilev. Yavo Isur treifa v'yachul al Isur cheilev. Okay, what does he say? Let's go back to our pasuk. Cheilev nevela v'cheilev treifa, yaseh l'chom alacha v'achol lo tochlu. Now it says, the cheilev of an animal that dies, right, which again, we're talking about kosher animal, and the cheilev of a treifa that, let's say, dies, or maybe even was slaughtered. Okay, you can use it, meaning it's not forbidden to benefit from or anything. It's not impure, but you can't eat it. And what do you mean? You can't eat cheilev when it's alive either. So what's this coming for, Rava says? It's to tell you that if you ate the cheilev of a nevela, you're chayav because of cheilev, and you're chayav because of nevela. Remember, we've seen cases in the Gemara where you could get 2 sets of malchot or 3 sets of malchot. If you eat a treifa, the cheilev of a treifa, you're chayav mishum cheilev, and you're chayav mishum treifa. And if it wasn't slaughtered, you're also chayav mishum nevela. You could get 120 lashes, minus 3. Okay, because, right, it's 39 times 3. But, okay, so now, basically, that's coming for some other completely different halacha, and now Rava answers with tzricha. Why do you need them both? Or maybe the Gemara adds this. We don't know if it was Rava himself or the Gemara. Why did you need to tell us both nevela and treifa? Maybe just say nevela, and you'd say obviously also for treifa, right? You'd be chayav for eating it because it's a treifa, and you'd be chayav because it's cheilev. Well, yesh mina nevela mishum demitamya aval treifa imalo. If you said nevela, you'd say, well, that's because nevela is tameh. But a treifa that was slaughtered, let's say, doesn't have tumah, maybe you're not chayav both. Yesh mina treifa mishum di isura michayim. Maybe a treifa is worse, because what we said before, it's almost worse because it's already forbidden in its lifetime. Aval nevela is only going to be forbidden once it dies if it's not slaughtered properly. Emalo tzricha. And that's why you need them both. Okay, so that's most of our sugya. What we haven't done yet is gone back to Rabbi Meir. What does he do with the psukim? So just to summarize until this point, we have Rav Shizbi who said, we started with Rabbi Yehuda who said treifa in the pasuk about nevela of means treifa that was slaughtered. And it's trying to tell you, treifa doesn't remove the tumah of nevela, even though it does in an animal, it doesn't in a bird ever. Not slaughtering, not melika, obviously. And then, right, which goes against Rabbi Meir, who thinks even melika. Okay, and of course slaughtering. Then Rav Shizbi said, what do you mean? Treifa means to exclude kosher. Okay? It's all to exclude non-kosher. Sorry, this is only kosher. Rabbi Yehuda then proved that from two other ways, right? One from a completely different pasuk and the other from different words in that same pasuk. And then we asked, why? What did Rabbi Yehuda do with the word treifa then in the cheilev pasuk? If treifa in the bird pasuk meant the treifa that was slaughtered, we can't plug that into the cheilev of the treifa that was slaughtered because an animal that was slaughtered is completely great. Okay, even though you can't eat it, but it certainly doesn't have tumah nevela. So we had three options. Either it came to include a chayat, which we rejected, or it came to talk about itself, that a treifa really it wanted to tell you, because maybe you would have thought it's not, the cheilev is tahor. You would have thought it's more like a non-kosher. And, right, we rejected that. And Rava, who said it's actually just coming to tell you that you're chayev lashes for nevela and for cheilev, and for isur treifa and for isur cheilev if you were to eat the cheilev of the animal. More like the focus there is not that it's tahor, the focus is that you can't eat it. Now we're going to go back to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, one second. Since I've been looking in the study guide, I need to just find where I'm in the Gemara. Okay, for Rabbi Meir. Hi treifa my avitle. Okay, we're a little toward the bottom of Amud Aleph. So now Rabbi Meir, what does he do with treifa? Because, if according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's treifa shenishchata, and he obviously doesn't think that. What does he do with that word? We saw this on yesterday's daf. What did we say? In order, and it was actually in the previous sugya, it wasn't in this Mishnah. It was that if you do a shchita inside the temple, remember it's not mitame beta blia. Why? Because it has to be something, in order to be mitame beta blia, it has to be something that's both inside and outside the same. And shchita is a good thing to do for a bird outside, even though it doesn't work in the temple. So if you slaughter in the temple, that actually removes the tumah of beta blia. You're not going to have that tumah. The Rabbi Yehuda, where's he going to learn that halacha from? He also needs to learn the halacha. If treifa is busy for him, because it's teaching treifa that was slaughtered, right, that it's still going to have tumah, so what does he do? Treifa achrin aktiv. He uses the treifa in the pasuk of a yikra kaf bet chet. Okay, and this is where, from the words lo yochal tamaba, he taught only kosher birds. But from the word treifa, he says that treifa comes to exclude shchita that's lifnim, has to be like a treifa, both is right forbidden inside and out. So that won't be. The Rabbi Meir, okay, now why didn't Rabbi Meir learn it from that pasuk? So we're going to say Rabbi Meir learns two things. Chal l'mi'ute shchita shilifnim. One is for what we just said, and chal l'mi'ute of tamei. And one, like Rav Shizbi said, remember what Rav Shizbi said, a treifa means only a kosher bird. So he uses one of the treifot to say only a kosher bird, like Rav Shizbi. For Rabbi Yehuda, where's Rabbi Yehuda going to learn that? Well, that we already know. Mi nevela nafkale. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda learns that all from the nevela. Nevela lo yochal tamaba. That's only a kosher one, but not a non-kosher. For Rabbi Meir, hi nevela my avidle. So now we have a problem because we had two things to darshan in that pasuk. One is don't eat a nevela litamaba, right, to make it impure, and the other was treifa. So we have a Rabbi Meir darshans with treifa. What does he do with nevela? L'shior achila b'kazayit. This is teach you something else. Now it says, don't eat the nevela, litamaba, right? It will make you impure. So now what does it mean? Well, eating in the Torah always requires a certain, according to the rabbis, a requisite amount of eating. How much? An olive bulk usually. So what it means is, now if I just put a little bit of this nevela of a bird in my mouth, I won't be matami to nevela. I have to have eaten a kazayit. So then they say, "V'tepuk krakama," but also in the first pasuk it says, "Chol nefesh asher tochal nevela" will be tamei. So it says achila and it says nevela. But Yikra Yud Zayin Tefav. Why don't we learn it from there? So he says, right, mida'af kerachmana b'lashon achila. It says there achila, right? Obviously the whole topic there was tumat nevela, but it talked about eating. So we should have learned kazayit from that pasuk. So now we have two pasukim that talk about eating. What is Rabbi Meir going to do with each one? Chal l'shir achila b'kazayit, v'chal l'shir achila b'chazayit b'chtechila pras. There's two things. Number one is how much you need to eat, and the other is in how much time do you need to eat it. And that's the shir b'chtechila pras that we've also seen a bunch of times. It's the amount of time we take it to eat half a loaf, which could be either 4 minutes, 9 minutes. It's all different opinions in halacha what this is. But leaving that aside, why do we need to tell you both that we need two psukim for this? In other words, if it's shir achila, achila is kazayit b'chtechila pras. Why do you need one pasuk to teach me that, one pasuk to teach me that? Well, okay, and we're almost done with this whole back and forth. Okay, here I think this is the last line of the sugya to tell you this important point. This whole nevelat of tahor, that your tummy when you're eating it, is a big chidush. Okay, if you didn't figure this out already, right? And like I said before, even the psukim it's not even clear that's what the psukim mean. This is like some weird thing, really, like from out of nowhere. So, since it's a chidush, you might have thought, maybe even if it took you longer to eat it, you'd still be impure. That's why you need the second pasuk to tell you no, not just a kazai, also kazai. Okay, that's done with all the back and forth. We're still not done with this whole topic. We still have till the end of the parak, which is on the next amud. But that's the main back and forth of all the different opinions and what they darshan, how they darshan those three psukim that we saw. Now, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a braita. It's as if we didn't learn anything we learned. Okay, like they're going to talk about things we learned and darshan them from psukim. Why do I say it's as if they didn't learn? Because these were Emoraim and right, trying to darshan what the Tanaim thought, and these are Tanaitic sources that happened before this whole discussion. So, cheilev nevela v'cheilev treifa. Okay, so now we're starting with this cheilev pasuk. Tanu Rabbanan. Sorry, I think I forgot those words, but now we're in a braita. Cheilev nevela v'cheilev treifa. B'cheilev behema Torah katuv medaber. Period. B'cheilev behema Torah katuv medaber. So now they're saying this pasuk is talking about a kosher animal, and that's again the cheilev of a kosher animal. Right? If the animal dies on its own, the cheilev is permitted. It is tahor, not permitted to eat. It's not impure. Even though the meat is impure, the cheilev is not. To which the Gemara says, and it's only a kosher animal. So now they say, right, meaning a non-kosher animal, everything will be impure. The meat and the cheilev. So now they suggest, like a classic midrash halakha, you sure? Maybe it's also non-kosher. You say it's kosher, but maybe it's also non-kosher. How do I know? So here's some logic one way and then the other way. Amarta tiher michlal shchuta v'tiher michlal cheilev. Shchita permits impurity, right? Shchita prevents the impurity from happening. If you slaughter an animal, it's not going to have tumah nevela. And cheilev, in a dead animal, right, an animal that dies, is also pure. So we're going to make this comparison. Now, when we say you slaughter an animal, it removes tumah nevela. Is that kosher or non-kosher also? Obviously only kosher. If you slaughter a non-kosher animal, we're not going to say, oh, that's not a nevela. Of course it's a nevela, right? Any non-kosher animal is going to be a nevela no matter what. So, since the shchita only permits, right, removes the tumah nevela and says you're going to be tahor in a kosher animal, when they say there's this pasuk that says the cheilev is going to be pure, even though the meat will be tamei, that's also talking about tohor v'lo b'tmeah. So we're making a comparison to the way shchita works, also this cheilev. Oh, kilach l'derech zo. Maybe the other way we would say. Tiher michlal nevela v'tiher michlal cheilev. So now, we don't really understand what this means yet, and the Gemara is going to ask later, what are you talking about? But what they mean is, in a nevelat of tahor, right, in our bird case, there's a case, right, this doesn't apply to non-kosher birds. It's going to be a case, non-kosher birds are actually pure, right? If I eat a non-kosher bird that died, or right, that was slaughtered, it doesn't matter, it's non-kosher bird, I don't have tumah nevela. That's the whole thing. It's only nevelat of tahor, kosher birds. Remember, the whole thing doesn't apply. And tiher michlal cheilev, and the cheilev is also going to be tahor. So there's a good comparison. Just like in non-kosher birds, there's no tumah nevela, and just like there's no tumah cheilev in a cheilev of behemah, so makish tiher michlal nevela b'tmei v'lo b'tahora. Just like when there's this tahara here in a nevela in a non-kosher bird, maybe the tiher michlal cheilev, maybe the cheilev pasuk is specifically talking about non-kosher, right? B'tmei v'lo b'tahora. They're even suggesting maybe this isn't even true for kosher animals. So they say, okay, now here's just a summary of the two sides. Amarta, finally we're turning to Amud Bet here. Kisheba b'derech zohi b'torah, and kisheba b'derech zohi b'tmeah. If we take option number one, then you're going to say the pasuk is talking about kosher birds. If you take option two, you're going to say kosher animals. Sorry, the cheilev pasuk talking about kosher animals. If you take option two, you're going to say it's talking about non-kosher animals. So which one is it? Talmud lomar treifa. This is going to learn from the word treifa. Okay, this is going to be like Rav Shizbi and like we put in Rabbi Meir's mouth. Mi sheyesh b'mina treifa. Yatzat me'ah she'ein b'mina treifa. Right? What is treifa coming to say? Treifa is coming to tell you this pasuk is only talking about kosher animals. Okay? Something that, like it, right, could become a treifa. meaning it has to be kosher, right? Treifa is totally irrelevant if it's not kosher. If it's not kosher, it's not kosher. Treifa is a totally irrelevant factor. Treifa is only a relevant factor for kosher, so that's how we get it. Okay, if so, the braita continues. Otzi et hatme'ah she'ein b'minat treifa. So fine, I get it. This doesn't include non-kosher animals. But lo otzi et hachaya she'yesh b'minat treifa. They're raising all the issues we raised already. What about a non-domesticated animal? That one fits in perfectly now because what did we just say? This is only an animal that could potentially become a treifa. Oh, chaya could also potentially, right? A treifa is relevant to it. Right? If chaya is a treifa and I slaughter it, it's not kosher, right? I can't eat it. So treifa is relevant in a chaya case, even though it's not relevant in a non-kosher. So then you would think that this pasuk includes the cheilev of a chaya is also pure, like an animal, like a domesticated animal. Talmud Lomar, that's why it says va'achol lo tuchluhu, meaning mishachal ba'asur u'b'sara mutar. Right? What does it say? Don't eat it. What is it trying to tell you here? It's someone who the cheilev is asur in general, and the meat is generally permitted, because this is telling you cheilev of an nevela don't eat, because you can't eat cheilev, right? In a regular animal, you can't eat the cheilev, you can eat the meat, right? If it's not a nevela. So this is trying to tell you, don't eat it, because cheilev can't be eaten. It must be only talking about animals for which the cheilev can't be eaten, and that's only behemot, not chayot. So yatzah chaya shechaba b'sara mutar. So even though you might have thought to include chaya, and this is actually what Abaye suggested, but we've rejected it. No, this isn't including chaya, because you need something that the cheilev and the basar are the same in a regular, in the regular case. I'm sorry, that's not what we're talking about in the pasuk. The pasuk is where you can't eat the cheilev because it's cheilev, and that's not a problem for chaya. So this can't be talking about a chaya. Okay, now we're just back to that last line, which I already explained. But Amalei Rav Yaakov bar Ada l'Rava, the bottom of Amud Aleph, Elame'ata nevela behema Torah hu demitama. Okay, the line said something very strange. It said, Tiher michlal nevela, right? When is a nevela going to be not impure, right? You're not going to have pure tumat nevela in a non-kosher animal and not a kosher one. Okay, that's so not true, right? In a nevela of an animal, it's actually specifically kosher ones that have, right, that the kosher and non-kosher are problems. Nevela is a problem across the board. It's not only a problem for non-kosher, it's also a problem for kosher. So what are you talking about, right? I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Kishatiher michal nevela. This is saying there's no problem of nevela for non-kosher. What do you mean there's no problem of nevela for non-kosher animals? Of course there is. So that's why they say, and this I already explained, right? So, again, the question is, from here you're going to say, nevela be'emat Torah hu demitama, but nevela be'emat me'ah lo matama? A non-kosher bird doesn't have tumat nevela? That's ridiculous. Of course it does. Amarle, kamasabi shabishtuba. There are many elders got confused by this line. Seifa atan l'nevelat of tameh. They were talking about specifically the of tameh, okay? It didn't tell you that. I told you that when we were reading it, because there was no way to read it otherwise. But basically that line was just talking about the nevelat of tameh, which again, the bird, we know, if it's not a kosher bird, there's no tumat nevela. That's where we have this exception that we tried to learn from. Okay, now we get to the last section. And Rabbi Yirmia is going to come up with a question. If you haven't had a confusing enough daf, this time at least his question is kind of fun and not so complicated. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan, or at least relatively speaking to the daf. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. So first we're going to start with a machloka, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and then someone who even builds on Rabbi Elazar. Back to Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir say? You do melika in the temple on a treifa bird, it removes tumat nevela, right? You don't have nevela blia, right? Tumat beta blia. Lo tiher Rabbi Meir elabit mimim abal ba'alei mumim. Lo, it has to be a bird that was ra'oi from melika, other than the fact it was a treifa. But if it had another problem, like it had a mum, which would have disqualified it, like it was missing a limb, that would be a problem. Meaning the melika wouldn't help. But Rabbi Elazar Amar, he was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, if you remember, afilu b'balei mumim, even if it's a blemished animal. Itmar nami, Amar Rabbi Rabbi, and it was also said that Rabbi says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Mitaher ayav Meir balei mumim, and he takes it even further, ba'afilu ba'avazim v'tarnagolim, even birds that don't go on the altar. You don't bring geese and roosters, you don't bring them on the altar. But if you did, and you did melika in the temple, it would actually remove tumat nevela. Okay? Now, comes Rabbi Yirmia and he asks the following question. By Rabbi Yirmia, Araf ez mahu. What if, okay, we're talking about egla arufa now. Egla arufa ceremony, you found a dead body in the middle, outside cities, and you don't know you measure the closest city. The Zevachim, the elders come and they break the back. They bring this this egla, a calf, to nachal eitan, to a certain type of nachal. They break the back of the neck, and that's the egla arufa ceremony. The egla arufa is forbidden to benefit from. These are all facts you need to know for the next section. What if you didn't do an egla, but you did an aiz? You took a goat instead of that. So what if you broke the back of the neck of that goat? Is that going to remove it from tumat nevela? Because if you say, here goes the analogy. Because my husband said yesterday we were learning. Good, you did the SATs. Okay, so here we go. The rooster, right? Melika to a rooster, which is not really right. You're not supposed to do melika to a rooster, but according to this opinion of Rabbi Meir, it works to remove nevela. Is like an egla arufa, or arifat egla, breaking the neck to a goat. Okay, if you did that to a goat instead of the breaking of a neck to a goat. So do you say avazim v'tarnagolim tamamai demina deofoninu? You say, look, avazim and tarnagolim are generally in the same category as the birds. Aval ez lav mina de eglahu, but a goat is not a type of calf. It's not at all similar. O dilma mina de behemahu. Or do you say, what do you mean it's not similar? It's a type of animal, and that's a type of bird. So maybe it does. Yativ Rav Dimi, the other line my husband had yesterday was, Rav Dimi had to sit down after this, okay, because Yativ means he sat. Okay, it was enough. We got to sit down at this point. And he said the following thing, this law, this question. Abaye says, wait. Now, they're not going to answer Rabbi Yirmia's question, but what they are going to do is raise a bunch of questions about his assumptions. Abaye says, Michlal de egla rufa torai? Who said that when you break the back of the egel, it's not an avela? It's not a shrita, right? Maybe it is a nevela. And then why is Rabbi Yirmia assuming it removes it from nevela? Amrlein, he says, in fact, it does remove it from nevela. Here comes our second analogy. Amri debe Rabbi Yanai kapara k'tiba kikodshim. Because it says kapara, since there's kapara by egla rufa, and there's kapara by sacrifices, what works for sacrifice is melika. The arufa works in the same way for the egla. Okay, so yes, it does remove it from tumat nevela. But here comes another difficulty. Matar Rav Natan avua de Rav Huna bar Natan, the father of Rav Huna bar Natan. Achol lo tochluhu. Okay, first we have to understand the braita, then we'll see how it raises the difficulty against the question. Achol lo tochluhu, don't eat it. Okay, this is the cheilev nevela, the cheilev treifa. Okay, don't eat it. Ainli ela cheilev shasur b'achila mutar b'hanaa. Cheilev shashor niskav egla arufa minayin. So now he says this question. This is talking about what cheilev is tahor. Cheilev that you can't eat, but you can use, right? What does it mean you can use it? You can benefit from it. So what if I had cheilev from a shor and his collar and egla arufa? Would I be able to eat the cheilev? Now, Talmud Lomar, kol cheilev. The braita says yes, because the pasuk before says all cheilev. Now, it's actually talking about all cheilev can't be eaten, but they assume it's connected with this. All includes even things that are forbidden b'hana'ah. Now, what does that have to do with anything? If, like you just said, based on Rabbi Yirmia's question, that, and the way they answered Abai was, yes, egla rufa removes from tumat nevela, then he to'ora v'chalbat tameh, they say, it doesn't make any sense to say the egla rufa is to'ora, because the whole question is the cheilev of the egla rufa, presumably after you break its neck, is the cheilev going to be pure? Which sounds like the animal is going to be impure. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking, is the cheilev pure? Of course, the cheilev is pure if the animal isn't a treifa, doesn't have tumat nevela. So what would you even be asking? So they say, no, you missed the point of the braita. And this is to answer the question. They're not talking about an egla rufa who you broke its neck already. Obviously, then that removes it, because that's like shrita for that egla. But if he was talking about what if you slaughtered it? The Gemara doesn't like that either. Like, you're not supposed to slaughter the egla rufa, but if you did, well, that would be called a nevela, and then the cheilev would be, right, that's the question, is the cheilev, right, that's what the braita says, yes, the cheilev is actually tahor. So now they say, Vitani le'shchita l'tarami de nevela. What do you mean? You slaughtered it, so who cares? You weren't supposed to slaughter this animal, but it's a kosher slaughter. Of course it's not a nevela. You can't ever call anything that was slaughtered a nevela. Fine, lo tzricha de meta. It must be it died. So wait. If it died, now what are we talking about? We asked this whole question about egla rufa because an egla rufa was forbidden b'hana'ah. Wait, if it dies, when does it become forbidden b'hana'ah? We assume when you break its neck, it becomes forbidden b'hana'ah. So, michal d'michayim asura, what? It's already forbidden b'hana'ah before it died, before you kill it, break its neck? Yes, last line for today. Amar Rabbi Yanai, Gvul Shamati v'Shachachti. They put a boundary on this and I forgot it. B'naz b'chebraya l'meimar, Yeridatan l'nachal eitan hiosarta. That's why I told you that we bring it to nachal eitan. When you bring it to nachal eitan, it already becomes forbidden b'hana'ah. And that's when we're trying. And then if it were to die, the braita is saying, okay, it's an egla, but the cheilev is permitted. And that was the chidush there. Okay, that didn't, okay, in the end, we still have Rabbi Yirmia's question, and with that, hadran halakhot. So what we did today, again, I kind of summarized at the beginning, but we took those 3 psukim, and we said, what did Rav Shizbi do with them to knock out Rabbi Yehuda? How does Rabbi Yehuda respond to that? What does Rabbi Meir dasher from all that? And within Rabbi Yehuda, what does he do with that word treifa and the cheilev, nevela, cheilev, treifa pasuk? And for that, we had 3 possibilities where we rejected all of them, but ended up with the 3rd. And then we got to some other braita that kind of said the drashot that some of the people had said earlier, that how do we know it's the cheilev is talking about kosher and not non-kosher? And then how do we know it's not about, that it doesn't include chayot? And then we ended with this question, right? Number 1, saying Rabbi Meir is even not limited necessarily, or machloket, Balei Mumim, maybe even Balei Mumim, he thinks it's okay if you do melika to them, and maybe even Avazim return to Golin, which got us to that question about the egla arufa, which made a certain assumption that breaking the back of the egel actually removes it from Tumat Nevela, and they say, is that really true? And then they brought this braita that seems to contradict, because there was already forbidden b'hana'ah, which they assumed happens after you break the neck, and then we said, no. Actually, it's forbidden from nachal eitan, and it must be talking about a case where it actually died, and it was an avela. And that's why they have the whole question about the cheilev. But if it was really the broken neck, you wouldn't need to say anything about the cheilev. The whole thing is actually not an avela. With that, we finish our complicated daf. It took a long time, but I hope it was clear, and you can use the charts to review. Wishing everyone a good week.